The dangers of the Wild West were certainly never too few and far between. Whether it was the constant threat of bandits or outlaws peering around every corner, constant conflicts between rival homesteaders and Native Americans, or the general sense of lawlessness that permeated the western frontier, safety and security were rare guarantees in a land plagued by troubles at every turn. These dangers didn't all come in the form of human bogeymen and endless infighting, however. Sometimes they came from the untamed wilderness, Mother Nature's unpredictability, and famine for the most unfortunate. They also came in the form of various diseases. Sickness ran rampant all across the early days of America's history, especially as Europeans settled across the country and brought with them plagues and pandemics that the Native Americans held no immunity towards. To make better sense of the calamity that sickness brought forth across the frontier, here are common diseases and illnesses seen in the Wild West. Without a doubt, the most destructive of all the diseases to strike the western frontier was cholera. Cholera is a bacterial infection of the small intestines, spread through unclean water and food contaminated by human feces. The illness sometimes presents little to no symptoms, but often is characterized by intense diarrhea over a few days, as well as severe muscle cramps and vomiting. With the diarrhea often comes an electrolyte imbalance that leads to physical deformities such as wrinkled hands, wrinkled feet, cold, tough skin, and red, sunken eyes. Cholera has been such a destructive force throughout history that it's actually spawned 7 different pandemics, including one that has been ongoing since 1961, according to the World Health Organization. The most critical cholera outbreak as it's related to the Wild West was the third cholera pandemic, which lasted from 1846 to 1860 and killed tens of thousands of people, most notably in Great Britain and along the California, Oregon, and Mormon trails of the western frontier. These numbers range anywhere from 6,000 to 12,000 fatalities, just on these 3 trails alone, not to mention the various other trails and settlements dotting the plains, mountains, and deserts that disappeared from disease as quickly as they were constructed. When considering the atmosphere of the westward trails and the poor quality of life in general in the Old West, it makes sense that cholera decimated so many lives in the 19th century. The trails offered very little opportunities by way of sanitation, whether it be folks bathing or cleaning their clothes. These activities usually occurred near unsafe drinking water that was consumed anyway, simply because dehydrated settlers had no other choice. Once the drinking water was contaminated, it would be tough sledding for the entire party. Folks with cholera became extremely dehydrated, and most likely continued to drink the bad water out of total desperation. It was for all intents and purposes a cycle of pain and death. And while not everyone who contracted cholera died, medicine was not even close to the point of being able to detect the bacteria early and keep folks hydrated while they toiled away, stranded in the wilderness. Due to the lack of medical care and proper electrolyte restoration, many who contracted the worst of the bacteria would die within 24 hours of the initial stomachache. While some doctors attempted to prescribe laudanum and camphor, nothing could cure cholera, only ease the crippling pain. Camphor was an oil derived from an Asian species of tree, while laudanum was an incredibly bitter tincture made from opium. This meant that if those taking the drug for cholera survived the disease, they'd most likely be left addicted to opium as a result. It was horrifying no matter how you looked at it. Cholera first appeared in American recorded history in 1832, traveling all the way to Missouri and Louisiana via riverboats along the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. It then broke westward during the 1849 California Gold Rush, before peaking in 1850 as large caravans of settlers made their way towards dreams of fame and fortune. Of course, pioneers weren't the only casualties of the disease, as cholera swept through Native American communities that shared contaminated water sources along those same trails. In fact, cholera was so bad in certain areas, 2/3 of the Southern Cheyenne tribes were wiped out from the disease, as well as half of the Pawnee tribes. Native American healers and medicine men were just as taken aback as their white counterparts, with nothing in their back pocket to relieve so many folks suffering from what would later be called the Unseen Destroyer. In a similar vein to cholera was dysentery, a disease not unknown to most civilizations around the world by the time westward migration began in America. Also known as bloody flux in various cultures, dysentery is a horribly uncomfortable sickness featuring fever and bloody diarrhea, which led to dehydration and the same slow death put on by cholera. There are two common causes of dysentery. One is a bacteria, and the other is a parasitic amoeba. Both of them infect the intestines and cause severe inflammation. Both are introduced to the human body the same way cholera spreads, through contaminated water and locations involving poor sanitation. One common sight seen along the Oregon Trail, and others like it, were deep holes dug along the banks of rivers, streams, and elongated marshes dotting the western landscape. These holes were used as watering holes and drinking wells for caravans on the go. They were also utilized by homesteaders in the short term, while wells were constructed and plumbing was but a distant dream. These shared water sources were then quickly infested with germs and bacteria, a ripe recipe for spreading disease. To treat dysentery, medics often prescribed castor oil, a vegetable oil derived from pressed castor beans. Of course, modern interpretations of castor oil clarify it as a laxative itself. However, back in the 19th century, it was thought to increase the appetite of those who were sick so that they might eat, stay hydrated, and avoid the pitfalls of electrolyte imbalance. Rounding out the gastrointestinal horrors of the Wild West is diphtheria, the technical term for throat distempers from around the world, dating back to at least the 16th century. Diphtheria is more commonly thought of as a childhood disease, with a bulk of cases coming in babies and children. However, it was also contracted by plenty of adults along the western frontier. The illness is an infection of a common bacterium, and while most cases are asymptomatic, it can still be spread regardless of symptoms. The bacterium travels from host to host by direct physical contact, but it is also an airborne disease that can stick on inanimate objects as well. Symptoms usually appeared 2 to 5 days after the initial exposure, and presented themselves through fever, followed by a sore throat featuring gray or white splotches covering the tonsils and the back of the throat. If these discolored patches grew to any significant size, the passage of air was partially or completely blocked, and even something as simple as breathing became increasingly difficult for the infected person. Lymph nodes have also been known to swell greatly in diphtheria cases, forming what is known as bull neck in infants and young children. There's also a second type of diphtheria that impacts the skin, eyes, and genitals. This comes in the form of lesions and blisters, which are sometimes so intense they form open wounds that leave the infected prone to other infections and other diseases. Diphtheria also came with swaths of other various complications that were especially difficult to treat while moving cross-country or hunkered down in a poor settlement. These included nerve inflammation, kidney failure, bleeding issues, abnormal heart rates, and sometimes even paralysis. With this in mind, it's easy to understand why diphtheria was so dangerous for both the very young and the very old. The mortality rate sat at around 5 to 10%, and there were no useful treatments at the time of westward migration. For this reason alone, diphtheria was considered the biggest child killer in all the Wild West, as simple rest and an increase in fluids wasn't enough to stave off the disease for the better part of a century. One of the most frequent diseases you'd hear about in textbooks about the Old West is a generic illness known as mountain fever. Mountain fever is actually the combination of a few different fevers and sicknesses, most often grouped together with Colorado tick fever, typhoid fever, and scarlet fever. Colorado tick fever is exactly what it sounds like, a virus brought on by the bite of an infected Rocky Mountain wood tick. While this specific illness differs from the Rocky Mountain spotted fever, their symptoms include much overlap. The fever was often contracted in the rural mountains of the Colorado Territory, bleeding up into Wyoming, Utah, Idaho, and Oregon, as the trails saw the brunt of the disease early on. infected parties usually felt symptoms creep up anywhere from 3 days to 3 weeks after the initial bite. The biggest issue with Colorado tick fever is the double onset of symptoms. One battle with the fever would linger for 3 days, then it would disappear before coming back with a vengeance. Those with the disease were warned not to get too relaxed in the eye of the hurricane, as was said in regards to the calm between storms. The most frequent issues with Colorado tick fever ranged from the obvious fever and chills to pounding headaches and light sensitivity. Folks would also suffer from muscle pain, vomiting, and rashes. These symptoms would then intensify during the second round of the infection. While death wasn't common with Colorado tick fever, its complicated nature drove infected parties mad. The virus could live in the bloodstream for almost half a year, making blood transfusions incredibly risky in the Rocky Mountain region, both back in the day and in modern times. There was and still is no proper treatment plan for Colorado tick fever, which meant many a sick miner in the mountainsides during Pikes Peak Gold Rush and beyond. Typhoid fever was a similar beast, transmitted by a bacteria called typhi that appeared much like the salmonella bacteria still commonly seen in contaminated food and water today. Typhoid fever rained hellfire on its unlucky victims, bringing symptoms forth as soon as 6 days after exposure. With it came weakness, headaches, stomach pain, and a spotty rose-colored rash. Many folks who encountered typhoid fever were unable to receive relevant treatment, and their symptoms would last for weeks on end. This could lead to mental confusion and loss of appetite, leading to cholera-like malnutrition. Worst of all was the highly contagious nature of the fever, which fed into the 20% mortality rate seen in the Old West, especially during the summer months. One of the popular myths spread amongst pioneers in the heyday of typhoid fever was that consuming lettuce could increase one's chances at survival if they contracted the bacteria. Of course, this did little to nothing in regards to treating the disease, and would sometimes increase infection rates if the lettuce came unclean and contaminated itself. The last of the 3 mountain fevers was scarlet fever, a disease caused by the infection of the group A strep bacteria, the same bacteria that causes strep throat in the present day. Scarlet fever differs in that the bacteria releases a toxin that causes a deep red rash to appear on the tongue and body. Other symptoms include sore throat, swollen lymph nodes, and a headache that doesn't seem to shake. There obviously was no vaccine back in the heart of the Wild West, nor is there one available in modern times. Thus, many of those who suffered from scarlet fever saw a lifetime of complications follow them. This meant kidney disease, heart disease, and arthritis all plagued the fever's survivors well into their middle-aged years. That is, if they lived long enough to begin with. To treat scarlet fever, doctors on the frontier would prescribe strict bed rest and usually a non-solid diet that consisted of liquid whey, rice water, or broth. While medicines couldn't cure the disease, the infected would be given Epsom salts, ammonia, or nitrate silver in attempts to stop the poison from working within the body. Some folks would go as far as to shave their head when battling the fever, to stay cool and allow for cool compresses to ward off the fever at its peak. With the introduction of penicillin and other antibiotics, the treatment for scarlet fever in developed countries is not anything what it used to be, but the same could be said for most of the diseases that ran rampant in the Old West. If anything, they gave reason to the age-old adage that the most deadly things in the world are the things you cannot see, making the western frontier a breeding ground for sickness and dangers like the stories of yesteryear told.